Kennewick Man. The two college students waded into the Columbia River looking for free entry into the Tri-Cities' biggest summer event, the hydroplane races on the Columbia River. About 10 feet from the river's bank, Will Thomas's foot hit something round lodged in the riverbed. He turned to his friend, Dave Deasy, and joked that he had found a human head. Reaching underwater, he felt something like a large rock and pulled it from the river. Examining the brown, mud-caked object, the young man noticed teeth and realized he really was holding a human skull. Not wanting to miss the final heat of the hydro races, the two hid the skull in some bushes along the shore. When the race ended, they returned with a bucket to retrieve the find. They dumped the mud-covered skull upside down in the bucket and proceeded to look for a policeman among the many who were working crowd control at Columbia Park in Kennewick that summer day of July 28, 1996. Thinking they had a murder on their hands, Kennewick police officers and Benton County Sheriff deputies took the boys by patrol boat to the site to see the exact location of their discovery. The investigators found more bone fragments in the river and on the shore. That evening, Columbia Basin Dive Rescue Team members were called in to help investigate the crime scene. They planned to map and tape off the area so that they could sift through the evidence. The skull was sent to the crime lab for examination. Upon initial examination, Benton County officials realized the skull was very old and had been buried for many years. Based on the skull's shape and facial bones, which appeared Caucasian, the coroner assumed it belonged to an early pioneer of European descent. The Benton County coroner called in Richland anthropologist and consultant James Chatters for further evaluation. Chatters returned to the site of the find and was able to excavate nearly a complete skeleton from underneath 3 feet of compacted earth and sand. Based on the shape of the skull, Chatters also believed the remains were those of the person of a European descent, so he was surprised to find an ancient stone-chiseled spear point embedded in the skeleton's pelvis. The ancient projectile was not something one would have expected to find lodged in a 19th century settler's hip bone. Chatters sent a sample of bone to the University of California at Riverside for carbon dating. The results could not have been more stunning. They showed that the man found in the Columbia River had lived in the area sometime between 7565 BC and 7235 BC. Soon after the announcement of the discovery of a 9,500-year-old skeleton, both excitement and controversy erupted. Scientists across the country became fascinated with the find, so old yet so different from what they would expect to find with an ancient American Indian skull. Fewer than 12 skulls older than 8,000 years had ever been discovered on the American continents. This skeleton, named Kennewick Man, was one of the oldest, most complete skeletons ever found in the Americas. Older bone fragments had been discovered in the Northwest. Cremated bones of a person who had lived in Washington 10,000 to 11,000 years earlier were found in 1968 at Marm's Rock Shelter. The excavation was cut off after only a few months when a flood of water from the Snake River's lower Monumental Dam covered the site. The complete skeleton of a 20-year-old woman dated 10,675 years old had been discovered near Buell, Idaho in 1992. Before a thorough study could be made, though, the skeleton was given to the Shoshone-Bannock tribes for burial. Representatives of the Umatilla and Colville Confederated tribes claimed Kennewick Man was an ancestor and demanded the bones be returned to them for burial pursuant to the Native American Graves Protection and Reparations Act. The 1990 federal law had been enacted to end the wanton destruction of grave sites and the thoughtless collecting of American Indian remains for souvenirs, sale, or study. American Indian bones were to be returned to indigenous tribes for respectful burial. Before the skeleton could be shipped to the Smithsonian Institute for an in-depth research, the American Corps of Engineers seized it. The fate of the Kennewick Man then lay with the Corps of Engineers. Though leased and managed as a park by the city of Kennewick, the land where the skeleton was discovered was owned by the Corps, which had jurisdiction over the remains. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Curtis Jr., the Corps' Walla Walla district engineer, waited until late October 1996 to see what claims would be made on the Kennewick Man. The Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, Confederated Tribes of Colville Reservation, Confederated Tribes, and bands of the Yakima Indian Nation, Nez Perce Tribe of Idaho, and the Wanapum band came forward to claim the bones. Since oral history stated that their ancestors had been part of the land since the dawn of time and had not migrated, the tribes believed the bones to be the ancient one as told by their history. These Northwest tribes believed that the study of the remains amounted to the desecration of a grave and was an affront to their very beliefs. They wanted to return the bones to the ground so that the spirit of the Ancient One could be at peace. The Army Corps of Engineers decided to return the bones of the Kennewick Man to the tribes for reburial. A group of scientists filed suit to stop the burial. Both the National Park Service and the U.S. Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, intervened on behalf of the tribes. The Corps of Engineers turned the bones over to the Secretary of the Interior, and in April 1998, the Corps buried the site of the original discovery under 2 million pounds of soil and gravel. Though the Corps claimed the action was needed to stabilize eroding shorelines and save migrating salmon, covering the area prevented any further excavating or the involvement of the Corps in future controversy. The action of the Corps effectively ended all efforts to determine whether other artifacts were present at the site. Years of litigation followed. Anthropologists argued that the bones were too old and dissimilar to be traced to any Northwest tribes of today. Therefore, Kennewick Man was not their ancestor. Kennewick Man's skull was long with a narrow face and cheekbones, a prominent nose and chin similar to the populations of South Asia. American Indians tended to have features more similar to those found in North Asia, wider, flatter faces, and rounder skulls. A federal judge ordered the bones to be moved to the Burke Museum at the University of Washington as a neutral repository until the dispute could be resolved. In 1999, a team of scientists was allowed to begin study of the remains in order to determine clues to his origins. Many theories of his origin were presented. His skull, teeth, and bone measurements were compared to 300 known racial and ethnic populations and did not match any of them. The scientists showed that cranial measurements and features of the skull most closely resembled those of Polynesians and South Asians, and were significantly different than those of any Indian tribe currently living in North America. Due to the age and conditions of the bones, no DNA could be found or extracted for testing. Anthropologists date the beginnings of the Columbia Plateau tribal culture to 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. They believe that shelters, diet, subsistence patterns, style of tools and weapons, and burial rituals were substantially different from the Kennewick Man's time. No villages or settlements were believed to have existed on the Columbia Plateau over 9,000 years ago. When human populations were small, nomadic groups traveling long distances for food and materials. They theorized that it was not until 2,000 to 3,000 years ago that populations began to settle in villages and bands related to existing tribes. Scientists argued that today's tribes' oral histories could be from a culture very different from the one which Kennewick Man belonged. The courts observed that 8,340 to 9,200 years between Kennewick Man's life and present day tribes was too long a time to bridge with oral tradition alone. Common belief held that the ancestors of American Indians crossed a land bridge over the Bering Sea from Asia to North America in one mass migration. There are some inconsistencies with that theory, such as that the number of different languages in the Pacific Northwest, the difference in features between Eastern and Western American Indians, and the fact that American tools seem to be designed like those found in Europe rather than in Asia account for inconsistencies. Were there multiple groups of humans who crossed the Bering Sea land bridge from different places and in different eras? Did the first Americans cross the Pacific in boats? A Polynesian man came forth in 2001 to stake a claim to Kennewick Man by filing to intervene in the federal case. Some anthropologists believe that the first Americans could have come from Europe via Iceland and Greenland when the sea levels were much lower. The Asaturu Folk Assembly, a group practicing pre-Christian European religion, later followed by the Vikings, conducted ceremonies in Columbia Park on August 27, 1997, and stated their belief that the Kennewick Man was their early European ancestor. So, who were Kennewick Man and his people, the first Washingtonians, who hunted and lived on the Columbia Plateau up to 9,500 years ago? This was a time predating all recorded history. The bones have told us that he looked different than today's American Indians. His skull was longer and less round. He was relatively tall. He stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall and was 35 to 55 years of age at the time of his death. As a teenager, he had suffered an attack by a human enemy. A spear had been thrown with such force that it entered the back of the hip and embedded itself in his bone. The attack had not killed the teen, though. Bone grew around the stone point as he aged. At some time in his life, he had also suffered a crushed rib cage and a withered arm. Still, he walked erect, did not limp, and suffered no arthritis. After his death, the body was immediately buried before scavengers could get to it. The dead man's body could have been covered by a natural event like a flood, or his tribesmen may have buried him. Was Kennewick Man part of a much earlier migration than the one thought brought descendants of today's Northwest tribes to the area? Did his people die out or intermarry with a later group? Will further study answer questions about the earliest inhabitants of Washington and America, and will it even be allowed? On February 4th, 2004, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the plaintiffs, scientists, could continue to study the remains of the Kennewick Man. The court held, because Kennewick Man's remains are so old and the information about his era is so limited, the record does not permit the Secretary of the Interior to conclude reasonably that the Kennewick Man shares a special and significant genetic or cultural features with presently existing indigenous tribes, people, or cultures. We thus hold that Kennewick Man's remains are not Native American human remains within the meaning of the NAGPRA. Studies of the Kennewick Man's remains by plaintiff scientists may proceed. After the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals remanded the case to the U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon, U.S. Magistrate Judge John Gelderks ruled on August 17, 2004, that any further legal action be limited to anthropologists studying Kennewick Man and to government agencies. This decision effectively bars Northwest Indian tribes from participating as a party in any further lawsuits. The tribes are attempting to intervene in the case and seeking to show that their oral traditions and beliefs are enough to show a cultural link to Kennewick Man, giving them a protectable interest in seeing that the remains in their burial site are respectfully studied, curated, and reinterred. Kennewick Man may yet find himself before the United States Supreme Court or Congress before this dispute is resolved. The mystery of the Kennewick Man may never be solved, although modern science is bringing us closer to a conclusion than ever before.